The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the weathered walls of the ranch house. Outside, snow fell thick and silent over the Wyoming plains, burying the land in white. Inside, warmth. Inside, the last hours of a dying man. William Harrison sat in his leather chair, the one worn smooth by 26 years of use. His hands, once strong enough to break a horse or build a fence, now trembled as they gripped a coffee cup. The scar running from his left temple down across his cheek, white against weathered skin, pulled slightly as he shifted position. 67 years old, a lifetime of war and peace of love and loss of secrets carried too long. Across from him, sitting cross-legged on the woven rug, his grandson Daniel worked a cleaning cloth along the barrel of an old hunting rifle. 13 years old, all elbows and earnest eyes, the boy had his mother's dark hair and his grandfather's gray gaze. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar. The kind of silence that exists between men who understand each other. Daniel looked up from his work. "Grandpa Will, you said you'd teach me to shoot today?" Will's lips curved just barely. The movement hurt. Everything hurt now. "Before you learn how to use that rifle, boy, you need to learn when to use it." His voice, once commanding enough to lead men through battle, had become gravel and whisper. "And maybe when not to." The boy's forehead creased. "I don't understand." Will set down his cup with care. His hands shook more than he wanted Daniel to see. "Let me tell you about a woman. People called her cursed, said she brought death to everyone who got close to her." He paused, drawing breath. "But she was the bravest person I ever knew." Daniel's eyes widened. "You mean Grandma Eleanor, Grandma, who makes the bread?" "The same." Will shifted forward in his chair. "But before she was your grandmother, before she was my wife, she was a widow that this whole town wanted to disappear. And he touched the scar on his face, an old habit. "I was a broken-down drunk hiding on this ranch praying for death." The boy set down the rifle, his task forgotten. "What changed?" "She did. Or maybe I did. Or maybe we saved each other." Will reached into the drawer of the side table and pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This is my diary, Daniel. Started writing it in 1865, the day the war ended. Never showed it to anyone. Not even your grandmother." Daniel leaned forward, drawn by the weight of the moment. "Why are you showing me now?" Will's eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had seen Gettysburg and Antietam, that had watched his first wife die, that had loved and lost and somehow found the strength to love again, met his grandson's. "Because I'm dying, son. And before I go, you need to hear this story. You need to understand what it means to stand up when everyone else sits down, what it keeps and why it's worth it." The fire popped. Snow hissed against the windows. The old man opened the journal to the first page, dated December 1878. His handwriting from 26 years ago stared back at him, young and certain. "Today I saved a woman's life," Will read aloud. "Or maybe she saved mine. I don't know yet which is true." He looked up at Daniel. "This is the story of how a crippled widow and a scarred soldier brought down the most powerful man in Wyoming territory, and found something neither of us thought we deserved." His voice dropped to almost nothing. "Love." Daniel pulled his knees to his chest, utterly still. Waiting. Will closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they saw not the warm room of 1904, but the cold streets of Ellington town in the winter of 1878. "It began," Will said, "with a pie." The cold bit hard that December afternoon. Will Harrison, 41 years old and feeling every year like a scar on his soul, stood outside Miller's General Store, with snow dusting the shoulders of his leather coat. He hadn't wanted to come to town, hadn't set foot in Ellington in over a year, not since Margaret's funeral, not since they'd lowered his sister into frozen ground, while Charles Thornton stood at the back of the mourners watching with those calculating eyes. But Jack Rivers, his ranch foreman, had been insistent. "Boss, we're out of flour. Clean out. Cook can't make biscuits, can't make bread, can't make anything. You want 20 ranch hands to starve, or you want to ride into town for 1 hour." So here Will stood, boots planted in 3 inches of fresh snow, listening to sounds drift through the door of Miller's store. Laughter, the cruel kind, women's voices high and sharp. His military training kicked in without thought. Assess the situation, identify threats, plan response. He'd been about to push through the door when he heard it. A woman's voice, thick with contempt, cutting through the winter air like a blade. Look at her crawling on her knees. Perhaps that's where she belongs. Will's hand froze on the door handle. More laughter. 3 women he counted by the distinct voices. And 1 target. He'd heard this before. In the army, they'd called it bullying. In polite society, they dressed it up with smiles and called it something else. But a soldier knew combat when he heard it, whatever form it took. He stood there 2 full minutes listening, long enough to hear every word, long enough to feel anger, cold and focused, settle into his bones. Then he opened the door. The scene assembled itself in his mind like a military tableau. 3 women in expensive silk dresses formed a half circle near the counter. Victoria Ashford at the center, her burgundy gown, pristine pearl earrings, catching lamplight. Behind her, Mrs. Patterson and Miss Doyle, ladies of means and leisure, their faces set in expressions of refined disgust. On the floor, a woman in a worn gray dress knelt among scattered pieces of pie. Flour dusted her hair. Berries stained her hands. She was gathering the wreckage with desperate efficiency, face burning red, trying to salvage something from nothing. Will saw her leg first. The left one. The way it bent slightly wrong, the way weight distributed unevenly when she tried to shift position. Old injury, permanent damage. The kind of wound that never fully healed. Then he saw her face, thin, yes. Marked by hardship, absolutely. But the chin was up. The jaw was set. Even kneeling in humiliation, she refused to bow. He'd seen that look before. On soldiers who'd lost everything but wouldn't quit. On men who kept fighting even when the battle was already lost. The women hadn't noticed him yet. Victoria Ashford was still talking, her voice dripping false sympathy. Tell me, Mrs. Wade, how long do you intend to keep pretending you can run a business? A woman who can't even walk properly trying to bake for respectable people. The woman on the floor, this Mrs. Wade, didn't look up. Her hands kept working, methodical and steady. My baking is fine. It's only my leg that's damaged. Only your leg. Victoria laughed and the others joined in like a chorus. Dear, everything about you is damaged. That pathetic little shop of yours. That rag you call a dress. That stubborn pride that keeps you from accepting charity like a sensible creature. Will had heard enough. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The sound cut through the laughter like a gunshot. Every head turned. Victoria's face transformed in an instant, surprise melting into calculated charm. Mr. Harrison, what an unexpected pleasure. I didn't know you still came to town. Will removed his hat slowly, deliberate. His gray eyes swept the scene once more, cataloging details. The woman on the floor finally looking up at him with eyes the color of summer storms. The 3 well-dressed predators suddenly uncertain. Mr. Miller behind the counter conspicuously silent. I don't usually, Will said. His voice carried the weight of years in command, quiet but absolute. But I needed supplies. He paused, letting the silence stretch. And I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. Victoria's smile never wavered. We were simply offering Mrs. Wade some friendly advice. No. The word landed like a stone. You weren't. Mrs. Patterson shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Doyle took a small step back. But Victoria held her ground, though something flickered behind her eyes. Will moved forward, positioned himself between the woman on the floor and her tormentors. Not aggressive, just there. A wall, a shield. I've been standing outside that door for 2 minutes, ma'am. I heard every word. He let that sink in. Then he spoke again, and his voice dropped lower, more dangerous for its softness. I spent 3 years watching men die in mud at Gettysburg and Antietam. I've seen courage, and I've seen cowardice. His eyes found Victoria's and held them. I've seen people at their best and their absolute worst. He gestured toward the woman behind him without looking back. This woman runs a business despite a bad leg. She shows up every day. She works with her hands. She asks nothing from anyone but the right to earn her keep. Then he took 1 step closer to Victoria Ashford. Close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. Close enough that the 2 women behind her backed up another step. You mock her for struggling. You attack her for not giving up. You call her cursed when she's simply wounded. He shook his head slowly. I've met a lot of people in my 41 years, ma'am, and the ones who tear others down to feel tall are the smallest people I know. On the silence in Miller's general store was absolute. Even the fire in the pot-bellied stove seemed to quiet its crackling. Victoria's face had gone red, her hands clenched in the fabric of her dress. Mr. Harrison, your reputation may protect you in most circumstances, but I assure you that my husband— Will cut her off. Your husband works at the bank. His tone didn't change. Didn't need to. My ranch employs 20 men and runs 3,000 head of cattle. I do all my banking in Cheyenne. He let that settle, then added almost conversationally, but if you'd like to test whose influence carries more weight in this territory, I'm happy to oblige. Something crumbled in Victoria Ashford's expression. The certainty, the superiority, the absolute confidence that she was untouchable. It all wavered, cracked, fell away. This isn't over, she said, but her voice had lost its edge. Yes, ma'am, Will replied. It is. Victoria gathered her skirts and swept toward the door. Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Doyle scurried after her like startled birds. The door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows. Then there was only silence, and snow hissing against glass, and the sound of a woman's unsteady breathing behind him. Will turned, looked down at her properly for the first time. She was still on her knees, though one hand braced against a flour barrel, trying to push herself up. Her legs shook with the effort. Pride and pain warred across her face. Here. Will pulled a chair over without asking. Sit down before you fall down. I'm fine. The words came automatic, defensive. No, Will said gently. You're not, and there's no shame in admitting it. He positioned the chair behind her knees. Please, sit. She sat. He didn't think she had much choice. Her leg had started to buckle. Without a word, Will crouched down and began gathering the remains of the ruined pie. He used his hat, scooping broken crust and scattered apples and flour-dusted berries into the crown. His hands moved with surprising gentleness for their size and roughness. You don't have to do that. Her voice was steadier now, stronger. I know. He kept working. I want to. Why? Will paused, looked up at her, really saw her. The way grief had carved hollows under her cheekbones. The way stubborn determination had set lines around her mouth. The way her eyes, despite everything, still held light. Because someone should have helped, he said simply, and no one did. Her breath caught, just slightly, but he heard it. I know that feeling, Will added quietly. I know what it's like to need help and have everyone look away. He stood, hat full of ruined food, and handed it to Mr. Miller. The store owner took it wordlessly, still pale from the confrontation. I'll need a bag for this, Will said. Then he turned to the woman in the chair. And whatever Mrs. Wade came here to buy, add it to my account. That's not necessary. She was on her feet again, swaying slightly but standing. Mr. Harrison, I appreciate what you did, but I can't accept, charity, Will finished for her. He saw the word hit, saw her stiffen. No, I don't expect you to. Then what? Payment, he met her eyes. For what I'm about to ask, I need regular bread delivery to my ranch. Enough for 20 men 3 times a week. My cook is hopeless with anything that requires rising dough. A slight smile touched his scarred face. I'll pay fair price, and I'll come by your shop tomorrow to discuss terms, if that's acceptable. She stared at him, searching his face for mockery, for pity, for any hint of the contempt she'd grown used to. He gave her none of those things, just waited. One condition, she said finally. Will raised an eyebrow. You let me repay you for today's supplies, in bread or pea or whatever you want from my shop. Her chin lifted. I don't take something for nothing. For the first time in 2 years, William Harrison smiled, really smiled. It hurt the muscles in his face, unused to the expression. But it felt right. Fair enough, Mrs. Wade. I'll come by tomorrow, 5:30 in the morning if that's not too early. My shop opens at 6. Then I'll be there at 5:30. She almost smiled back. Almost. Will helped her load the supplies into her small cart outside. The snow was falling harder now, fat flakes that clung to everything they touched. Eleanor Wade's old mare stamped nervously, breath steaming in the cold air. At the cart, Will paused. Those women, they do that often. Eleanor's hand stilled on a flour sack. Often enough, I've learned to ignore it. You shouldn't have to. She looked at him then, really looked past the scar in the weathered exterior, trying to read what lay beneath. Mr. Harrison, I appreciate what you did in there, truly. But I've been dealing with the Victoria Ashfords of this world for 3 years now. They won't stop because one man publicly shamed them. Maybe not. Will's gray eyes held hers. But maybe you don't have to deal with them alone anymore. Before she could respond, he touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect she hadn't received from anyone in longer than she could remember. 5:30 tomorrow, Mrs. Wade. She hesitated. Then Eleanor. My name is Eleanor. William. He tested how her name felt. But most people call me Will. I'll see you tomorrow, Will. He mounted his horse and rode out of town without looking back. But Eleanor stood there in the snow, watching until he disappeared into the white landscape. Something in her chest, something that had been frozen for 3 long years, began to thaw. She didn't know it yet, but that moment, that tiny crack in the ice around her heart, would change everything. Will Harrison rode slowly back toward his ranch, but his mind was already 3 miles ahead, already turning over the encounter in Miller's store. The weight of old instincts, military habits that never quite left, pressed him to analyze what had just happened. He'd made a choice, stepped into a conflict that wasn't his, declared himself publicly on the side of a woman he didn't know, and he'd felt alive doing it. That realization sat strange in his chest. For 2 years since Margaret's death, he'd been going through motions, running the ranch because it needed running, eating because his body required fuel, sleeping when exhaustion finally dragged him under. But not living, never living. Today, for the first time in 2 years, he'd felt his blood move. The ranch house came into view as dusk settled over the snow-covered plains. Lights glowed in the windows. Smoke rose from the chimney. Home, if you could call it that, when it felt more like a prison of memories. Jack Rivers met him at the stable, taking the horse's reins with a knowing look. Got the flour in the saddlebag. Good. Cook was about ready to mutiny. Jack paused, his weathered face creasing with concern. You were gone longer than usual. Everything all right in town? Will swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting packed snow. Fine, just had to handle something. Something, huh? Jack's eyes narrowed. You look different. Can't put my finger on it, but I'm the same as I always am. No, boss, you ain't. Jack led the horse toward the stable. You got a look I haven't seen since before Miss Margaret passed, like you found something to care about again. Will didn't answer, couldn't really, because Jack was right, and that terrified him more than anything Victoria Ashford could threaten. Inside the ranch house, the familiar emptiness wrapped around him. Margaret's room still exactly as she'd left it, the chair by the fire where she used to sit and read. The small touches that marked a woman's presence now just ghosts. Will poured himself whiskey, sat in his chair, stared into flames. Eleanor Wade, widow, baker, crippled in some accident that had left her limping and alone, mocked by the town's finest, fighting to survive when most people would have given up and moved on. He knew that fight, knew it bone deep. The fight to keep going when everything inside you screamed to quit. After Rebecca and little William had died, Will had wanted to quit, had put his service pistol in his mouth and tasted metal in despair. Margaret had found him, knocked the gun away, held him while he broke into pieces. Promise me, she'd whispered through her own tears. Promise me you'll live, Will. Promise me you'll find something worth fighting for again. He'd promised, and he'd kept that promise even when it felt like dragging himself through broken glass. Even when every morning was a fresh battle just to open his eyes. Then Margaret had died. Margaret had. And the only thing that kept Will from breaking his promise was the knowledge that she'd died trying to save him. That to quit now would make her sacrifice meaningless. But surviving wasn't living. He'd learned that in 2 years of holidays. Today, though, today had been different. Will drank his whiskey and made a decision. Tomorrow, 5:30, he'd go to Eleanor Wade's bakery. He'd arrange for bread delivery. And maybe, just maybe, he'd find out why a woman he'd never met before had made him feel human again. The knock came just after 8. Will wasn't expecting visitors. No one came out to the ranch anymore except Jack, and Jack never knocked. He opened the door to find Dr. Marcus Webb standing on the porch, snow dusting his shoulders, his medical bag in hand. Doctor. Will stepped aside. Something wrong. Webb entered, shaking snow from his coat. That depends on your perspective. His eyes, usually kind, looked worried. "Can we talk?" They sat by the fire. Webb declined whiskey, which told Will this was serious. The doctor never turned down good liquor. "I heard about what happened at Miller's today," Webb said without preamble. "Mrs. Patterson came by the clinic. She was quite agitated." Will said nothing, waited. "She told me you publicly confronted Victoria Ashford, defended Eleanor Wade." Webb leaned forward. "Is that true?" "It is." "Do you have any idea what you've done? Stopped 3 women from tormenting someone who couldn't fight back." Will's voice carried an edge, same as any decent person would do. "Will," Webb's tone was gentle but firm, "you don't understand the dynamics here. Eleanor Wade has been the town outcast for 3 years. People believe she's cursed, that anyone who gets close to her ends up hurt or dead. Superstitious nonsense. Maybe, but it's powerful nonsense." Webb rubbed his face. "Her husband, Henry Wade, died in a wagon accident. She was badly injured. The wagon wheel broke on the steepest grade outside town. Henry was thrown, hit his head on a rock. Died instantly. Eleanor was trapped under the wreckage for hours, her leg crushed." Will felt something cold settle in his stomach. Accident. That's what the sheriff ruled. But there were rumors. Henry had been arguing with Charles Thornton about selling his property. Thornton wanted the land. Henry refused. 2 weeks later, Henry was dead. The cold spread. "You're saying Thornton killed him?" "I'm saying there were questions." Webb's hands twisted together. "Questions the sheriff chose not to pursue. Questions that died when Eleanor Wade became the town pariah. Easier to blame the victim than investigate the powerful." Will stood paced to the window. Outside, snow fell in the darkness. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know you will. I've known you since you came to this territory 15 years ago. I knew you when Rebecca and William died. I knew you after Margaret's accident." Webb's voice dropped. "And I know what you're thinking right now, that maybe Margaret's death wasn't an accident either." Will's hand clenched on the window frame. "How did you—" "Because I've thought the same thing for 2 years." Webb's admission hung in the air like gun smoke. "Margaret died 3 weeks after you turned down Thornton's offer to buy your ranch. Her horse spooked on flat ground in broad daylight. No one could explain why. I examined the horse afterward, found a rope burr under the saddle, fresh, deliberately placed." The world tilted. Will turned slowly. "You found evidence of murder and said nothing." "I reported it to Sheriff Martin." Webb's face was gray. "He told me I was seeing things. That grief was making me paranoid. He warned me to let it go." "And you did." The words came out flat, dead. "I was afraid." Webb met his eyes. "I'm still afraid, but I'm also tired of being a coward. That's why I'm here. To warn you." "Warn me about what?" "Charles Thornton doesn't forgive and he doesn't forget. You humiliated his wife in public. You've aligned yourself with Eleanor Wade, and now you're asking questions without even realizing it." Webb stood. "Be careful, Will. Men who cross Thornton tend to have accidents." After Webb left, Will sat alone in the dark for a long time. The fire burned down to embers. The whiskey bottle emptied. And in his mind, connections formed like constellations. Margaret refusing to let him sell the ranch. Margaret dead 3 weeks later. Henry Wade refusing to sell his property. Henry Wade dead in an accident. A pattern. A terrible, murderous pattern. And now Eleanor Wade still on that property, still refusing to leave. Still in danger. Will looked at the clock. Midnight. 5.5 hours until he was supposed to meet Eleanor at her bakery. 5.5 hours to decide if he was going to walk into danger willingly, knowingly, with his eyes wide open. He thought of her face, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she'd gathered that ruined pie with dignity and tact, the way she'd refused charity but accepted fair trade. He thought of Margaret's last words, barely a whisper, as she died in his arms. Not accident. He'd thought she was delirious. Now he knew better. Will stood, went to his bedroom, pulled a box from under the bed. Inside, his service revolver from the war. Cleaned, oiled, loaded. He hadn't touched it since the night he'd almost used it to end everything. He tucked it into his belt. Then he sat down to wait for dawn. If Thornton wanted a war, Will had fought bigger ones, and lost more than any man should lose. He had nothing left to fear. and that made him very dangerous indeed. Present day. The fire had burned low, Will's coffee had gone cold, and Daniel sat frozen eyes wide with something between horror and fascination. Margaret was murdered. The boy's voice cracked. Aunt Margaret that you told me about, the one I'm named after. Will coughed, the sound wet and painful. Daniel jumped up, brought, water hovered with the helpless concern of the young facing mortality. Sit down, son. Will waved him back. I'm not dead yet. He smiled faintly, though I'm working on it. This isn't funny. No, it's not. Will took a sip of water, his hand shaking. Margaret Harrison was murdered because she stood between Charles Thornton and something he wanted. My ranch. The silver deposits under it that he knew about, but I didn't. Daniel's fists clenched. Did you kill him, Thornton? Did you make him pay? Patience, Will's eyes glinted with something that might have been approval. You're thinking like a Harrison. But vengeance isn't justice. And what we did to Thornton was worse than killing him. What did you do? We destroyed him. Your grandmother, Dr. Webb, Jack Rivers, and me. We exposed every crime, every murder, every piece of corruption. We brought him down in front of the whole territory. Will paused. But I'm getting ahead of the story. He opened the journal again and found another entry. Let me tell you about the morning I went to Eleanor's bakery. The morning that changed everything. Daniel leaned in, and Will's voice, thin and fading, began to weave the tale again. 5:30 in the morning came dark and cold. Will rode through empty streets, the only sound his horse's hooves crunching through fresh snow. Eleanor's bakery sat at the edge of town, a small building with living quarters above. Light glowed in the windows. Smoke rose from the chimney. She was already working. Will tied his horse and stood outside for a moment, breathing in the smell of baking bread. It reminded him of childhood, of his mother's kitchen, of a time before war and death had taught him what the world really was. He knocked. The door opened before his knuckles finished falling. Eleanor stood there in a flour-dusted apron, her dark hair pulled back, her face flushed from oven heat. You actually came. I said I would. Will removed his hat. I'm 15 minutes early. Is that a problem? Come in before you freeze to death. The bakery was warm, almost hot after the bitter cold outside. Shelves lined the walls, mostly empty this early. A large work table dominated the center. Ovens glowed against the back wall, and the smell. God, the smell of fresh bread made Will's chest ache with memory. Eleanor poured coffee without asking, handed him a cup. Their fingers brushed in the exchange just for a second. She pulled back quickly. You run a good operation, Will said, looking around, taking in the orderliness, the cleanliness, the efficiency. I learned from my father. He was a baker in Ohio. She wrapped her hands around her own cup. Before he died. And your husband? A pause. Henry was a miner. He had the dream of opening a shop. I had the skills. Her voice went soft. He died 3 years ago. The same accident that did this. She gestured to her left leg. I know. Will met her eyes. Dr. Webb told me. Her face shuddered. So you know I'm cursed. That anyone who gets close to me ends up hurt. Bitterness edged her words. Why are you here, Mr. Harrison? What do you really want? I told you, bread for my ranch hands. No one does business with me anymore. Not if they can help it. The only reason I survive is because I charge less than anyone else, and some people's greed outweighs their superstition. She set down her cup hard enough that coffee splashed. So I'll ask again. Why are you here? Will took a long moment to answer. When he did, his voice carried weight. Because my sister died 2 years ago in a riding accident that wasn't an accident. Because Charles Thornton tried to buy my ranch and I refused. Because 3 weeks later Margaret was dead, and I've spent 2 years knowing it was murder, but unable to prove it. The color drained from Eleanor's face. She gripped the table edge. What? Dr. Webb found evidence. A rope burr under Margaret's saddle, placed deliberately to spook the horse. Will's jaw clenched. He reported it to Sheriff Martin. The sheriff buried it. Why are you telling me this? Because I think the same thing happened to your husband, and I think we both know who's responsible. Eleanor's breath came fast, shallow. Henry said, the morning of the accident, he said the wheel looked cracked. I told him we should wait, get it fixed. He said it would hold. Her voice broke. I blamed myself for 3 years. for not insisting, for trusting him, for, for being human. Will crossed to her, stopped a respectful distance away. Eleanor, if that wheel was sabotaged like I think it was, then Henry's death isn't your fault any more than Margaret's is mine. You don't know that the wheel was sabotaged. It could have just been, Thornton wanted your property. Henry refused to sell. 2 weeks later, Henry was dead. Will's voice was gentle but relentless. Does that sound like coincidence? She was shaking now. Will watched her fight for control, watched her spine straighten, and her chin lift even as tears threatened to spill. Warrior. Even in grief, even in fear, she was a warrior. If you're right, she said slowly, then I've been living next to my husband's murderer for 3 years, seeing him in church, passing him on the street, watching him smile. Yes, and there's nothing I can do about it. He owns the sheriff. He owns half the town. He's untouchable. No one's untouchable. Will's eyes went cold. I learned that in the war. Every man has a weakness. Every fortress has a crack. Eleanor looked at him, really looked, saw past the scar and the hard exterior to something burning underneath. You want revenge. I want justice, he paused. But I'll settle for revenge if that's all I can get. They stood there in the warm bakery, two broken people recognizing each other across a gulf of pain. The bread in the oven was almost done. Outside, dawn was beginning to break, and something was starting. Something dangerous and necessary, and possibly doomed. What do you need from me? Eleanor asked. Everything you remember, about Thornton's threats to Henry, about the accident, about anything that seems strange. Will set down his coffee cup. And I need you to trust me. I don't know you. I know. His scarred face was serious. But I defended you yesterday when I didn't have to. I'm here this morning when I could have stayed safe on my ranch. And I'm about to make an enemy of the most powerful man in Wyoming for a woman I just met. He held out his hand. Sometimes trust is a choice you make before you have all the answers. Eleanor stared at his outstretched hand. Calloused, scarred steady despite everything. A hand that had held rifles and reins, that had fought and built and survived. She put her hand in his. All right, Will Harrison. Her grip was firm. Let's find justice or revenge, whichever comes first. They shook on it there in the warm glow of the ovens, making a pact that would change both their lives. Neither one knew yet what it would cost. Neither one knew that this moment, this joining of hands and purpose would lead to love and loss and a legacy that would echo through generations. But somewhere in that small bakery, as dawn broke over Wyoming, two survivors became something more. They became a force. And Charles Thornton's empire, built on blood and fear and unchallenged power, had just felt its first tremor. The foundation was beginning to crack. 3 days passed like the slow turn of a wheel. 3 days of Will arriving at Eleanor's bakery before dawn of coffee and quiet conversation of plans taking shape in whispers. 3 days of watching, waiting, gathering courage for what came next. On the 4th day, as winter darkness still held the sky, a knock came at Eleanor's door. Not Will's firm, steady rap. This was hesitant, almost apologetic. Eleanor opened the door to find Dr. Marcus Webb standing in the snow, his medical bag clutched like a shield, his face pale in the lamplight. Dr. Webb, she stepped aside. It's early for a house call. This isn't a house call. Webb's eyes darted past her into the warm bakery. Is Harrison here? Not yet. He'll be here in 20 minutes. Eleanor read the fear in the old doctor's face. What's wrong? Everything. Webb stepped inside, closed the door, leaned against it like his legs might give out. Everything's wrong and I can't stay silent anymore. Eleanor poured him coffee. His hand shook so badly the cup rattled against the saucer. She'd never seen Marcus Webb afraid. In 3 years of treating her mangled leg through pain that made her scream, he'd always been steady as stone. Now he looked like a man facing his own execution. I need to tell you something, Webb said, about Henry's death, about the accident that wasn't an accident. Eleanor's breath stopped. What? 3 years ago, after they brought you both back to town after they'd buried Henry and set your leg, I examined the wagon. Webb's voice was barely above a whisper. Professional curiosity, I told myself. Just making sure there wasn't anything we could have done differently. He took a long drink of coffee, set the cup down, met her eyes. The wheel wasn't just cracked, Eleanor. Someone had cut through the axle, almost all the way through, left just enough to hold for a while, designed to fail at the worst possible moment. The bakery spun. Eleanor gripped the table edge, knuckles white. What did you say? It was murder. Webb's face crumpled. Henry was murdered. And I knew. I've known for 3 years, and I said nothing. You knew. The words came out flat, dead. You knew my husband was killed, and you stayed silent. I reported it. Webb was crying now, tears streaming down his weathered face. I went to Sheriff Martin that same day, showed him the cut marks, explained how it couldn't have been natural wear. He looked at me like I was insane, said grief was making me see things that weren't there, told me to keep my observations to myself. And you did. I was afraid. The admission broke something in him. Thornton owns half this town, the sheriff, the judge, the territorial officials. I'm just a country doctor. If I pushed too hard, if I made noise, I'd end up like Henry, like all the others. Eleanor's vision blurred. 3 years. 3 years she'd blamed herself. 3 years of guilt that had eaten her alive, convinced that if she'd just been firmer, if she'd just insisted they wait for repairs, Henry would still be breathing. And it had all been a lie. There were others. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, distant, like someone else was speaking. Webb nodded. A miner named Patterson refused to sell his claim to Thornton, fell down a mine shaft 3 months later. I examined the body. The injuries weren't consistent with a simple fall. He was speaking faster now, words tumbling out like a confession held too long. A widow named Foster wouldn't leave her property despite Thornton's pressure. Her cabin burned with her inside. The fire was too hot, too fast. Someone had used accelerant. How many? Eleanor whispered. How many people has he killed? I don't know for certain. 5, maybe 7. All of them on land Thornton wanted. All of them in the past 10 years. Webb's hands twisted together. And I documented nothing. Said nothing. Buried my suspicions because I was too much of a coward to stand up. The door opened. Will Harrison stepped inside, shaking snow from his coat. He took one look at the scene, his military mind processing it in seconds, and his hand dropped to the revolver at his belt. What happened? Eleanor turned to him. Will had never seen her cry, not when Victoria Ashford mocked her, not when she spoke of Henry's death, but now tears ran freely down her face, and her voice shook with fury. Dr. Webb has something to tell you about Margaret, about the rope burr you found. Will's eyes went to the doctor. Cold. Dangerous. Talk. Webb talked. He told Will everything he'd just told Eleanor, about the wagon axle, about the pattern of deaths, about Sheriff Martin's warnings to stay silent, about 10 years of watching Charles Thornton kill with impunity while the law looked the other way. When he finished, Will stood so still he might have been carved from stone. Only his eyes moved gray as winter storms, and in them, Webb saw something that made him understand why men had followed this man into battle. You examined Margaret's horse, Will said finally. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, which made it more terrifying. You found evidence of murder, and you buried it. Yes. My sister died believing I'd keep her safe. She died in agony, her neck broken, calling for me. Will took one step closer to Webb, just one. And you could have given me the truth. Could have let me know it wasn't just bad luck or my failure to protect her. Could have given me something to fight for instead of drinking myself toward death. I'm sorry. Webb was openly sobbing now. I'm so sorry, Will. I was afraid. I'm still afraid, but I'm more afraid of dying a coward than I am of Thornton. Why tell us now? Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. After 3 years, why break your silence today? Because Harrison is asking questions. Because you two are forming an alliance. Because Thornton will see that as a threat. Webb looked between them. And because men who threaten Charles Thornton tend to have fatal accidents, I won't have 2 more deaths on my conscience. Will turned away, paced to the window. Outside, dawn was breaking, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. Beautiful, deceptive, hiding corruption under prettiness. We need proof, Willis said, real proof, witnesses, documentation, something that even Thornton's bought judges can't ignore. There's a federal marshal, Webb said. Henry Carson. He comes through Cheyenne once a month. He's honest. One of the few who can't be bought. When's he due? 3 weeks, maybe 4. Will spun back. Too long. Thornton's already moving against us. Will spun back. Too long. Thornton's already escalating. After what just happened at your shop, we need to move faster. Eleanor's hands clenched. The memory of broken glass and red paint was still fresh. Then we don't wait. We force his hand now. Then we make Thornton overconfident, Will said. We let him think we're weak, isolated, easy to eliminate. His smile was sharp as broken glass, and when he makes his move, we're ready. That's using Eleanor as bait, Webb said, horrified. Yes. Will looked at her. If she's willing. Eleanor thought of Henry, of 3 years believing his death was her fault, of Victoria Ashford's cruel laughter and the town's whispered accusations, of a life lived in the margins, always afraid, always alone. She thought of Margaret Harrison dying in her brother's arms. She thought of Patterson and Foster and 5 others whose names she didn't even know. I'm willing, Eleanor said. What do we do? They planned through the morning. Will sketched out strategy like the cavalry officer he'd been thinking in terms of terrain and timing and acceptable losses. Eleanor contributed what she knew of Thornton's habits, his allies, his weaknesses. Webb offered a lifetime of small observations, the kind of details a doctor notices. By the time the bread came out of the ovens, they had the bones of a plan, dangerous, possibly suicidal. But it had one advantage that Thornton wouldn't expect. They had nothing left to lose. Will left as the sun climbed higher. He had to maintain appearances, couldn't be seen spending too much time at Eleanor's shop. But at the door he paused. If this goes wrong, he said quietly, for her ears alone, if Thornton moves faster than we think, you come to the ranch, immediately. Don't pack, don't wait, just come. I can take care of myself. I know you can. His scarred face was serious. But you don't have to anymore. That's what I'm trying to tell you. After he left, Eleanor stood in her empty bakery and felt something shift in her chest. For 3 years, she'd armored herself in pride and isolation, convinced that needing anyone was weakness. Will Harrison was teaching her different. That strength could mean accepting mom, that surviving alone was harder than surviving together, that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't cursed after all. Just unlucky. And unlucky could change. The door opened again. Eleanor turned, expecting a customer. Victoria Ashford stood in the doorway. Alone, no entourage, no silk dress and pearl earrings. Just a woman in a simple wool coat, her face drawn with something that looked almost like fear. Mrs. Wade, Victoria's voice lacked its usual edge. May I speak with you, please? It's important. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, but something in Victoria's expression stopped her. This wasn't the woman who'd mocked her in Miller's store. This was someone else, someone desperate. Come in. Victoria entered slowly, as if afraid Eleanor might change her mind. She didn't sit, just stood there, hands clasped, looking smaller than Eleanor had ever seen her. I came to warn you. The words tumbled out fast. My husband owes Thornton money, gambling debts, $15,000. Thornton said he'd forgive the debt if I helped convince certain people to leave town. Eleanor's stomach dropped. People like me. Yes. Victoria's face flushed. I didn't know about the murders. I swear I didn't know. I thought it was just business. Thornton wanted properties, my husband needed debt relief. I made some women uncomfortable enough to sell. It seemed harmless. Harmless. Eleanor's voice could have cut steel. You made my life hell for 3 years because your husband can't control his gambling? I know. Tears started down Victoria's cheeks. I know what I did. I know what I am. But last night I overheard Thornton talking to 2 men. Rough men. The kind who do work that decent people don't ask about. What did you hear? He told them to make you disappear, like the others. He said your friend Harrison is asking questions, getting too close. Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper. He wants you dead, Mrs. Wade. Within the week. The bakery seemed to tilt. Eleanor gripped the counter for support. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm not a murderer. Victoria's voice broke. I'm vain and cruel and weak. I let my husband's problems turn me into a monster. But I won't have blood on my hands. I can't. She reached into her coat, pulled out a folded paper. This is a list. Everyone Thornton has targeted in the past 10 years. Names, dates, how they died. I've been keeping records. Insurance, I told myself. Proof that I wasn't involved in the actual killings. Eleanor took the paper with shaking hands, unfolded it, saw 7 names written in careful script. Patterson, Foster, 5 others, and at the bottom, in fresh ink, Henry Wade. You knew. Eleanor looked up. All this time you knew my husband was murdered. I suspected. Victoria couldn't meet her eyes. But I told myself it was coincidence, that Thornton was ruthless in business, but not actually criminal. I told myself a lot of lies, Mrs. Wade, and I'm done lying. She turned toward the door, paused. The men Thornton hired are named Frank Morrison and Dutch Keller. They've done his dirty work for years. They'll come for you soon. Be ready. Why help me now? What changed? Victoria looked back, and for the first time, Eleanor saw real humanity in her face. Because yesterday, Thornton told my husband that if the debt isn't paid by spring, he'll take our house, our home, everything we have. She smiled bitterly. Turns out I'm only loyal when it doesn't cost me anything. The moment it threatened what's mine, I found principles. At least you found them. Eleanor folded the paper carefully. That's more than some people ever do. After Victoria left, Eleanor sat alone with the list of the dead. 7 names, 7 people who'd stood up to Charles Thornton and paid with their lives. She should have been terrified. Part of her was, but a larger part felt something else entirely. Clarity. The sound came just after Eleanor had hidden Victoria's list in her apron pocket. Glass shattering. Multiple windows at once. Eleanor spun toward the front of the shop. Through the doorway, she saw them. 3 men faces covered with bandanas standing in the street. One held a rock, another a can of paint. She moved toward the door but stopped when the first rock crashed through her display window. Shards exploded inward, glittering like ice across the floor. The carefully arranged loaves she'd set out that morning tumbled and scattered. "Get out while you can, witch!" one of the men shouted. His voice was rough, deliberately disguised. "This is your last warning." The second man hurled his paint can. It struck the door, exploding in a spray of red that looked too much like blood. Letters dripped down the wood. Cursed. Eleanor's hands shook. She wanted to run to hide, to pretend this wasn't happening. But Will's words echoed in her mind. You don't have to deal with them alone anymore. She grabbed the broom from behind the counter and stepped toward the door. "Eleanor, no!" But Webb's voice came from somewhere behind her. He must have been in the back room, hadn't left yet. "Don't go out there." But she was already moving. Not to confront them, she wasn't that foolish. But to stand in her doorway in full view and let them see she wouldn't be driven out like a frightened animal. The third man raised another rock. Eleanor saw it coming, saw the arc it would make toward her head. Time slowed. The rock never made it. A rifle shot cracked across the street. The rock shattered mid-air fragments, scattering like snow. The 3 men froze. Will Harrison stepped out from the shadows of the building across the street, his rifle still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. He'd been watching, protecting her even when she didn't know it. "Next one's not aimed at rocks," Will said. His voice carried across the empty street, cold and absolute. "Leave. Now." The men ran, scrambled onto horses, and disappeared into the gathering dusk. Eleanor stood in her doorway, surrounded by broken glass and red paint that spelled her supposed curse, and felt something shift inside her. She'd stood her ground, and Will had been there. He crossed to her, lowered the rifle. "Are you hurt?" "No." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "You were watching." "I told you, you're not alone anymore." Will looked at the destruction, his jaw tight. "Pack what you need. You're coming to the ranch, tonight." Eleanor looked at her shop, her livelihood. 3 years of building something from nothing, now vandalized and violated. She could stay, could clean it up, could pretend tomorrow would be different. Or she could accept that Will was right. Thornton was escalating, and staying here meant death. "All right," she said. "Let me get my things." As she gathered her belongings, Eleanor realized the fear that had gripped her for 3 years had transformed into something else, something harder, something that burned instead of froze. Thornton wanted her gone. He'd have to do better than broken windows and paint. She was done running. For 3 years, she'd been fighting to survive, accepting scraps, enduring humiliation, keeping her head down and hoping the world would leave her alone. No more. Thornton wanted her dead fine. Let him try. But he'd find out that Eleanor Wade wasn't. Henry wasn't, Patterson wasn't, any of the others who'd faced him alone and afraid. She had Will Harrison. She had Dr. Webb. She had Victoria's list and the truth, and a burning need for justice that had been banked for too long. Charles Thornton had created an enemy, and that enemy was done being a victim. Eleanor locked the bakery, ignoring the pain in her bad leg, and began the walk to Harrison Ranch. Will had said if things moved fast, she should come immediately. Things had just moved very fast indeed. The ranch sprawled across the valley like a promise. Barns and bunkhouses, corrals filled with horses, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. Will's kingdom built with sweat and stubbornness and the refusal to quit, even when quitting would have been easier. Jack Rivers met her at the main house, his weathered face creasing with a concern. "Mrs. Wade, something wrong?" "I need to see Will. It's urgent." Jack studied her for a second, then nodded. "He's in his study. Come on." The ranch house was simple but solid. Good furniture, well-maintained, everything in its place. A soldier's home. A man who valued order and reliability. Will looked up as Eleanor entered his study. One glance at her face and he was on his feet. "What happened?" she told him. "Everything. Victoria's visit, the warning about Morrison and Keller, the list of names." Will listened without interrupting, his expression growing harder with each detail. When she finished, he took the list from her hands. "Read it slowly." His finger stopped on Margaret's name, handwritten at number 6. Victoria Ashford kept records. Will's voice was soft, dangerous. She knew. They all knew. And they did nothing. "She's doing something now." Eleanor sank into a chair, exhaustion hitting her all at once. "She gave us names, evidence, a chance." "A chance to what? Get killed?" Will paced like a caged wolf. "Thornton's moving faster than we thought. Morrison and Keller are professionals. They've killed before. They won't hesitate." "Then we don't give them the chance." Eleanor straightened despite her aching leg. "We force Thornton's hand, make him act in the open where people can see." "How?" "I announce that I'm meeting with Marshal Carson. Loudly, publicly, say I have evidence of criminal conspiracy." Eleanor's eyes were hard. "Thornton panics, sends his men, and we're ready for them." Will stopped pacing, looked at her like he was seeing someone new. "That's using yourself as bait. That's using myself as a weapon." She stood, moved to face him, close enough to see the gray in his eyes, the old scar tissue pulling at his temple. "I'm done hiding, Will. Done being afraid. If Thornton wants me dead, he can try, but I won't go quietly into whatever grave he's planning." Something shifted in Will's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "This could get you killed." "Living like I have been is already death." Eleanor's voice was steady. "Just slower. At least this way I die fighting." Will held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, sharp and decisive. "All right. But we do this smart. Military strategy, not cowboy heroics," he called for Jack. Within an hour, they'd assembled a war council in Will's study. Jack Rivers, sharp-eyed and loyal. Dr. Webb, nervous but determined. And a young ranch hand named Tom, who'd grown up in Thornton's household and knew the man's routines. Will spread a map of Ellington on his desk. "Thornton will send Morrison and Keller after Eleanor. We know that now. Question is when and where." "The bakery," Jack said. "That's where she's most vulnerable, alone at night after closing." "No." Will's finger tapped the map. "Too public, too many potential witnesses. They'll wait until she's traveling, between town and here." "Or they'll burn the building," Tom offered quietly. "Make it look like an accident. Lamp knocked over fire spreads. Happens all the time in winter." Will's jaw clenched. "Then we don't give them the chance at the bakery. Eleanor, you're staying here until this is over." "I have a business to run." "You'll have a grave to fill if Thornton gets to you first." Will's tone left no room for argument. "We need you alive to testify. That means safe. That means here where I can protect you." Eleanor wanted to argue. Pride demanded it, but common sense and the memory of Henry's broken body won out. Fine, but I need to get some things from the shop first. I'll go with you. Will buckled on his gun belt. Jack sent word to the sheriff that we're investigating threats against Mrs. Wade. Make it official. Put Thornton on notice that we're watching. Sheriff Martin's in Thornton's pocket, Webb protested. Doesn't matter. Creates a record. If something happens to Eleanor, there's documentation that we warned them. Will's smile was cold. Cover our legal bases while we plan for the illegal ones. They rode to town in the afternoon light, Will and Eleanor and Jack. The streets were quiet, most people indoors against the cold. Eleanor's bakery looked small and vulnerable, its windows dark. Inside, Eleanor gathered essentials. Clothes papers, the small box where she kept what little money she'd saved. Will and Jack checked the building, securing windows, making sure no one was hiding in the shadows. Got what you need? Will asked. Eleanor looked around the shop she'd built from Henry's dream and her own stubborn refusal to quit. 3 years of sweat and pain and small victories. It might all burn tomorrow. Thornton might destroy everything she'd worked for, but she'd be alive, and she'd have the chance to destroy him right back. I'm ready, she said. They rode back to the ranch as evening fell. Dinner was simple but good. Eleanor ate at Will's table, surrounded by ranch hands who treated her with awkward respect. After she helped clean up, needing something to do with her hands, Will found her in the kitchen after everyone else had left. I'm putting you in Margaret's old room. It's clean, comfortable, door locks from the inside. You don't have to do that. Yes, his voice was firm. I do. Eleanor followed him upstairs down a hallway lined with closed doors. He opened one, stood back to let her enter. The room was frozen in time. A woman's room preserved exactly as she'd left it. Quilt on the bed, books on the shelf, a photograph on the dresser showing a young woman with dark hair and Will's gray eyes laughing at the camera. Margaret, Eleanor said softly, my sister, my friend, the person who saved my life when I wanted to die. Will's voice was thick. After Rebecca and William passed, I put a gun in my mouth, wanted it over, wanted to stop feeling everything. Margaret found me, knocked the pistol away, held me while I broke. He touched the photograph gently. She made me promise I'd keep living, that I'd find something worth fighting for again. I kept that promise even when it hurt, even when she died and I wanted to break it. Eleanor turned to face him. Why are you telling me this? Because I need you to understand. Will met her eyes. If something happens to you because I brought you into this fight with Thornton, I'll never forgive myself. Margaret died because of me, because she tried to protect me from selling the ranch. I can't carry another death. Margaret didn't die because of you, she did because of Thornton. Eleanor stepped closer. And Henry didn't die because I was weak. He died because a murderer wanted our land. She reached out, took Will's scarred hand in hers. We've both been carrying guilt that doesn't belong to us. Maybe it's time we put it down and pick up something else. Like what? Like rage, like justice, like the truth that we're not victims. Her grip tightened. We're survivors, and survivors fight back. Will looked at their joined hands. Then he did something Eleanor didn't expect. He pulled her close, wrapped his arms around her, held her like she was something precious and breakable and worth protecting. Eleanor stiffened at first. She'd forgotten what human touch felt like, what warmth meant. But slowly, carefully, she let herself sink into the embrace, let herself feel safe for the first time in 3 years. I won't let him hurt you. Will whispered into her hair, whatever it takes, whatever I have to do. You're not alone anymore. Eleanor's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. Neither are you. They stood like that for a long moment, two broken people holding each other up. Outside, night fell over the ranch. Inside, something was growing between them. Fragile, yes, new and uncertain, but real. When Will finally pulled back, his expression had changed, softer, vulnerable in a way that probably scared him. Sleep well, he said quietly. Tomorrow we plan how to end this. Will, Eleanor stopped him at the door. Thank you. For everything. For seeing me when everyone else looked through me. I see you, Eleanor Wade. His gray eyes held hers. I see your strength and your courage and your refusal to quit. I see someone worth standing beside. He left before she could respond, closing the door gently behind him. Eleanor sat on Margaret's bed in Margaret's room in the house of a man she'd known less than a week and felt something crack open inside her chest. Something that had been frozen since Henry died. Since the town turned against her. Since she'd learned to expect nothing from anyone. Hope. Dangerous, terrifying, impossible to suppress. Will Harrison had walked into her life like a winter storm. And he was teaching her that broken didn't mean worthless. That surviving alone was harder than surviving together. That maybe, just maybe, she deserved more than scraps and shadows. Eleanor lay down in the darkness, listening to the ranch settle around her. Somewhere down the hall, Will was probably planning strategy, cleaning weapons, preparing for war. Tomorrow they'd set a trap for a murderer. Tomorrow they'd risk everything on a desperate gamble. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor Wade felt something other than fear. She felt alive. In his study, Will sat at his desk with Victoria's list spread before him. 7 names, 7 murders. His finger traced Margaret's name, and he felt rage and grief, and something else he was almost afraid to name. Purpose. For 2 years he'd been existing, going through motions. But Eleanor had given him a reason to fight again, a cause worth risking everything for. And maybe if they survived this, something more. Will opened his journal, dated the page. December 14th, 1878. He wrote carefully, the words forming a record for whatever came next. Tomorrow we make our stand. Eleanor has agreed to serve as bait to draw out Thornton's hired killers. It's dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it's also necessary. Evil unchallenged grows stronger, and I'm done letting evil win. If I die tomorrow, I want it known that I died fighting, that I finally found something worth protecting, someone who reminded me what it means to be human. Her name is Eleanor Wade, and she's the bravest person I know. If I survive, I'm going to tell her that. I'm going to tell her what she's come to mean to me, that she saved me just as surely as Margaret did, though in a different way. I'm going to tell her I'm falling in love with her, but first I have to keep her alive. God help me, I have to keep her alive. He closed the journal, loaded his rifle, checked his revolver. Tomorrow would bring violence, that was certain. The only question was whether it would also bring justice. Will Harrison had fought at Gettysburg. He'd survived Antietam. He'd watched brothers in arms die in mud and blood and horror. Tomorrow's battle would be different, smaller scale, personal instead of political, but it mattered more than any fight he'd ever faced, because this time he wasn't fighting for a government or a principle or a piece of ground. This time he was fighting for her, and that made all the difference. The attack came at midnight, not subtle, not quiet, the kind of violence that announced itself with breaking glass and the smell of kerosene. Will was already awake, had been for hours, watching from the upstairs window with his rifle across his knees. He saw them coming across the snow-covered fields, 2 men moving with the confidence of those who'd done this work before. Frank Morrison and Dutch Keller, Thornton's hired killers. They thought the bakery was empty. Eleanor had made sure everyone in town knew she'd closed up shop, was staying with friends out of fear. Jack had spread the rumor well. The bait had been set. What Morrison and Keller didn't know was that the building wasn't empty. Jack Rivers sat in the back room with a shotgun. Tom waited in the alley with another. And Will Harrison, 41 years old and carrying more scars than any man should, watched from across the street with a veteran's patience. The trap was sprung before Morrison could pour the first drop of kerosene. "Drop it, Inayim," Will's voice cut through the darkness. "Drop the can and put your hands where I can see them." Morrison spun, reaching for the gun at his belt. He was fast, but Will had fought at Gettysburg, had survived 3 years of war by being faster. The rifle shot echoed across the frozen town. Morrison went down screaming, clutching his shoulder. The kerosene can hit the snow, spilling its contents in a dark stain. Dutch Keller ran, made it 3 steps before Jack emerged from the shadows, shotgun leveled. "Don't even think about it." Within minutes, both men were subdued, bound, their blood melting the snow beneath them. Within the hour, Marshal Henry Carson, who'd arrived a week early, thanks to an urgent telegram from Dr. Webb, had them in custody. And by dawn, when the whole town gathered to see what the commotion was about, Charles Thornton's empire had begun to crumble. Morrison talked first. Faced with a murder charge and the rope, he sang like a canary, desperate for mercy. Dutch followed. Between them, they laid out 10 years of Thornton's crimes in meticulous detail. Patterson pushed down the mine shaft at Thornton's order. Foster burned alive in her cabin. the rope burr placed under Margaret Harrison's saddle, and Henry Wade's wagon wheel cut 3/4 through with a saw. Marshal Carson listened to it all, his weathered face growing grimmer with each confession. When they were done, he turned to Will and Eleanor, standing together in the cold dawn light. "This is enough," Carson said quietly. "More than enough. I'll arrest Thornton today. Trial will be in Cheyenne in 3 weeks. Territorial court. I'll make sure Judge Harlan presides. He can't be bought." Will's hand found Eleanor's. "We'll be there." "Count on it," Carson said. "You're both key witnesses. This is your justice as much as anyone's." Charles Thornton was arrested that afternoon, dragged from his bank in chains while the whole town watched. He screamed about injustice, about false accusations, about how he owned half of Wyoming, and they couldn't do this to him. But they could, and they did. The trial began 3 weeks later in the federal courthouse in Cheyenne, the largest courtroom in the territory, packed to the rafters with spectators, press, families of the victims. Everyone wanted to see the mighty Charles Thornton brought low. Eleanor sat in the gallery next to Will, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles were white. She'd dressed carefully that morning in a simple blue dress that had been her mother's. Respectable, dignified. Nothing like the ragged widow Thornton had tried to destroy. Will wore his best suit, the one he'd been married in. The scar on his face stood out stark against his pale skin. He looked like what he was, a soldier, a survivor, a man who'd lost everything and refused to surrender. Judge Harlan, 60 years old, with eyes like chips of granite, called the court to order. The prosecution began their case, methodically building it brick by brick. Victoria Ashford's list of names, the confessions of Morrison and Keller, Dr. Webb's testimony about the cut wagon wheel and the rope burr. Then they called Will to the stand. He walked to the witness box with the same steady gait that had carried him through 3 years of war, placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Ross, stood. "Mr. Harrison, please tell the court about your sister Margaret." Will's voice was steady. "Margaret Harrison died September 15th, 1876. Officially ruled a riding accident. But it wasn't an accident." "How do you know?" "Because I found a rope burr under her saddle, placed there deliberately to spook her horse. Fresh rope tied in a way that would dig into the animal's flesh with every movement." Will's hands clenched on the witness box rail. "I reported it to Sheriff Martin. He buried the investigation." "Why would he do that?" "Because 2 weeks before Margaret died, Charles Thornton offered to buy my ranch. I refused. My sister died because she stood between Thornton and land he wanted, and the sheriff chose to protect a murderer rather than seek justice. Thornton's lawyers objected. Judge Harlan overruled them. The testimony continued. "Mr. Harrison, you have served in the military, correct?" "Yes, ma'am. Union Cavalry, 1862 to 65. "You saw combat. Gettysburg, Antietam, a dozen smaller engagements." Ross paused. "You've seen death then. You understand the difference between accident and murder." "Yes, ma'am, I do." "In your professional judgment as a veteran and a rancher, was your sister's death an accident?" Will looked directly at Thornton, the man who'd smiled at Margaret's funeral, who'd offered condolences while her blood was still warm. "No, ma'am, Margaret was murdered, and that man ordered it." The defense attorney, a slick lawyer from Denver named Hughes, stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Harrison, you attempted suicide after your wife's death, didn't you?" The courtroom went silent. Eleanor's breath caught. Will didn't flinch. "Yes, I put a gun in my mouth. My sister stopped me." "So you've struggled with mental stability?" "I've struggled with grief, with loss, with survivor's guilt." Will's voice was hard. "But I know the difference between depression and murder, and I know what I found under that saddle." Hughes pressed. "Isn't it possible you saw what you wanted to see? A rope burr that occurred naturally, interpreted through the lens of paranoia?" Will leaned forward. "I fought at Gettysburg. I watched 7,000 men die in 3 days. I've seen courage and cowardice. I've seen people at their best and their absolute worst." His gray eyes burned. "And I know murder when I see it. Charles Thornton killed my sister. He killed Henry Wade. He killed 7 people over 10 years. And if you let him walk out of here, he'll kill again." No one in that courtroom doubted him. Eleanor testified next. She told them about Henry's warnings that the wheel was cracked, about his death, about 3 years of guilt and isolation, about Thornton's pressure to sell, about the town that had turned its back because facing the truth was harder than blaming the victim. Her voice shook at times, but it never broke. She stood there a widow with a crippled leg and demanded justice with a strength that made the jury sit straighter. The defense tried to paint her as bitter, as unreliable, as motivated by greed rather than truth. Eleanor looked at them and said simply, "I watched my husband bleed to death in the snow. I spent 3 years believing it was my fault, and now I know it wasn't. That knowledge doesn't bring Henry back, but it means his death meant something. It means we stopped a killer, and that's worth every bit of pain I've endured." The jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they filed back in, their faces were set, determined. The foreman, an older rancher who'd known both Will and Eleanor, stood when Judge Harlan asked for the verdict. "On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of Henry Wade, how do you find guilty? On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of Margaret Harrison, guilty." It went on. Patterson, Foster, 5 others. 7 guilty verdicts in total, plus conspiracy, plus fraud, plus a dozen lesser charges that hardly mattered next to the blood on Thornton's hands. Charles Thornton stood when the verdicts were read, his face purple with rage. "This is an outrage. I own half this territory. You can't—" "Sit down," Judge Harlan said quietly, "or I'll have you gagged." Thornton sat, but his eyes promised murder, promised that somehow, some way he'd make them all pay. He never got the chance. Judge Harlan sentenced him to death by hanging. 3 months later, in the prison yard in Cheyenne, Charles Thornton climbed the steps to the gallows. A crowd gathered to watch. Justice, they called it. Eleanor and Will were there, not celebrating, but witnessing, making sure it was done. When the trap door opened and Thornton dropped, Eleanor felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, just a deep, bone-tired relief that it was over. "Is this what justice feels like?" she asked Will quietly as they walked away. No, Will's arm was around her shoulders. "Justice would be having them back. Henry, Margaret, all of them. This is just the best we could do." The town of Ellington threw a celebration when they returned, a spring festival, the first in 5 years. Thornton had always blocked such gatherings, afraid people might talk, might compare notes, might realize the pattern of deaths. Now he was gone, and the town wanted to atone. Mayor Thompson presented commendations to Will Eleanor and Dr. Webb, called them heroes, said they'd saved Ellington from a monster. Dr. Webb accepted his with trembling hands in a speech full of apologies for not speaking sooner. Will accepted his with a soldier's grace, deflecting credit to others. Eleanor stood before the assembled town, the same people who'd whispered about her curse, who'd avoided her shop, who'd made her 3 years a hell, and she spoke from her heart. "3 years ago, I believed I was cursed, that everyone who got close to me ended up hurt or dead. I believed it because you told me it was true, because it was easier to be isolated than to ask hard questions about why so many people were dying." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. "But I'm not cursed," Eleanor continued. "I'm just a woman who survived something terrible and refused to give up. And standing here today, I want you to remember something. The next time someone in this town is struggling, the next time you see someone who's different or damaged or fighting against odds, don't look away, don't whisper, don't make them face it alone." She found Will in the crowd, "because I wouldn't have survived without people who chose to stand beside me, who saw past the limp and the poverty and the fear, who reminded me that broken doesn't mean worthless." The applause was thunderous, but Eleanor barely heard it. She only saw Will standing at the back, his scarred face transformed by a smile. That evening, as the festival continued, Will led Eleanor to the dance floor. She protested. Her leg hurt. She couldn't dance. He pulled her close anyway. "We can be terrible together." They weren't terrible. Will led with surprising grace, and Eleanor's bad leg somehow didn't matter when he was holding her. They moved through the other couples like they'd been dancing together for years instead of months. Midway through the song, Will stopped. Right there in the center of the floor with everyone watching, he dropped to one knee. Eleanor's breath caught. "I've been trying to find the perfect moment," Will said, his voice carried in the sudden silence. "But I've realized there's no such thing. There's just now, and I don't want to waste any more time." He pulled a ring from his pocket, simple gold worn smooth. This was Rebecca's wedding ring. I thought I'd never give it to anyone else. But she'd want me to be happy. She'd want me to find love again. His gray eyes found Eleanor's. And I have. Eleanor Wade, you're the bravest person I've ever met. You survived what should have destroyed you. You stood up when everyone told you to fall. You made me remember what it means to be alive. Will, Eleanor's voice broke. Let me finish. He smiled. I want to wake up next to you every morning, fall asleep beside you every night, build a life together, a real life full of all the joy we've both been denied. He held up the ring. I'm scarred and damaged, and I come with more ghosts than any woman should have to carry. But I love you, and if you'll have me, I promise to spend every day proving I'm worthy of you. Eleanor looked down at this man, this broken soldier, who'd defended her when no one else would, who'd fought beside her, who'd shown her that she deserved more than survival. Yes, the word came out choked with tears. Yes, I'll marry you. The crowd erupted as Will slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly as if it had been waiting for her all along. He stood, pulled her close, kissed her in front of the whole town that had once called her cursed. And Eleanor Wade, soon to be Eleanor Harrison, finally understood what it meant to be blessed. Present day. The fire in Will's study had burned down to embers. Daniel sat, frozen tears streaming down his young face. You married her, the boy whispered. After everything, you found each other and you married her. Will coughed, the sound wet and painful. His face had gone gray. We had 26 good years, Daniel. 2 children, you and your cousins. A life fuller than I ever thought I deserved. And you stopped Thornton. You got justice. We did. Will's breathing was labored now. But justice came with a price. Always does. Daniel moved closer, taking his grandfather's hand. Grandpa Will, you need to rest. I need to finish the story. Will's grip was weak but insistent. Because the story doesn't end with me and Eleanor. It ends with you. He gestured to the journal still lying open on the table. Everything I learned, everything Margaret taught me, everything Eleanor showed me, it's all in there. The ranch is yours now, Daniel. I signed the papers last week. But Dad, your father has his own ranch in Montana. He understands. Will's voice was fading. This land needs a Harrison to run it. Someone who knows what we fought for, what we built, what we sacrificed. I'm only 13. You're a Harrison. Will's eyes, those storm gray eyes, held his grandson's. And Harrisons don't quit. We don't give up. We stand up for people who can't stand for themselves. We fight for justice even when it costs us everything. That's our legacy. Not the land, not the cattle. The choice to do what's right even when it's hard. The door opened. Eleanor entered, moving slowly with her cane. She was 62 now, hair silver face lined with years. But her eyes were still the same summer storm color. Still held the strength that had first caught Will's attention in that mercantile so long ago. You told him the whole story, she asked softly. Most of it. Will tried to smile. Left out some of the kissing. Thought that might embarrass the boy. Eleanor came to his chair, knelt beside it with difficulty. Took his hand. Are you ready, my love? I am. Will's voice was barely a whisper now. I've lived a good life. Better than I earned. You earned every moment. Eleanor's tears fell freely. You saved me, William Harrison. You saw me when everyone else looked away. You made me believe I was worth something again. You saved me first. Will's other hand came up to cup her face. That day in the mercantile, when you refused to stay down, when you gathered that ruined pie with your dignity intact, that's when I knew. That's when I started living again. He looked at Daniel. Promise me, boy. Promise me you'll remember this story, that you'll live it, that when you see someone being torn down, someone struggling, someone the world has decided isn't worth defending, you'll stand up, even if it costs you, especially if it costs you. I promise. Daniel's voice broke. I promise, Grandpa Will. Good boy. Will's breathing was slowing. Eleanor, I love you, always have, always will. I love you too. Eleanor pressed her forehead to his. Go be with Margaret and Rebecca and William. They've been waiting. You've earned your rest. Will's eyes closed, his breathing slowed further, then stopped. Eleanor held him for a long moment, this man who'd changed her life, who'd loved her despite her scars, who'd shown her what it meant to fight for something bigger than survival. Then she let him go. The funeral was the largest Ellington had ever seen. Every rancher in 3 counties came. Every person who'd ever known Will Harrison. Even Marshall Carson, retired now, but still sharp, made the journey from Cheyenne. They buried Will on the hill overlooking the ranch next to Margaret. Simple headstone. William Harrison, 1837–1904. Soldier, protector, beloved husband. He fought for justice. Daniel stood at the grave with Eleanor, trying to be strong, failing, 13 years old and watching his hero lowered into frozen ground. He wanted you to have this. Eleanor pressed the journal into Daniel's hands after everyone had left. Everything he learned, everything he wanted to pass on, it's all in here. Daniel opened it to a random page. Will's handwriting, strong and certain, stared back at him. The war taught me how to fight. Margaret taught me why to live. Eleanor taught me what's worth dying for. Anyone who reads this, remember, broken doesn't mean worthless. Surviving alone is harder than surviving together. And one person standing up can change everything. He'd keep reading that journal for the next 70 years. Would pass it to his own grandchildren one day. Would use it as a guide when the world got dark and uncertain. But that night, Daniel simply held it close and tried not to cry. 6 months later, winter 1905. Daniel had grown. Not in height, not much, but in something harder to measure. He'd taken over running the ranch with Jack Rivers' help, learning as he went, making mistakes, but never quitting. One afternoon, he rode into Ellington for supplies. The town had changed since Thornton's execution. Sheriff Martin had been removed, replaced with an honest man. The bank had new ownership. Victoria Ashford had moved east with her husband, seeking a fresh start. But some things stayed the same. As Daniel tied his horse outside Miller's general store, he heard laughter inside. The cruel kind, high and sharp. His military training, the kind inherited in blood if not experience, kicked in. Assess, evaluate, respond. He pushed through the door. 3 young men, probably 17 or 18, surrounded a girl at the counter. She was younger than them, maybe 16, with dark skin and an accent that marked her as an immigrant. Italian, Daniel thought. One of the families who'd come to work the mines. The groceries she'd been buying were scattered on the floor. Flour and beans and dignity all spilled together. "Look at the clumsy foreigner," one of the boys sneered. "Maybe you should go back where you came from." The girl was crying, trying to gather the mess, just like Eleanor had all those years ago. Daniel didn't think, didn't plan, just acted. He stepped between the girl and her tormentors. Not aggressive, just there, a wall, a shield. "Gentlemen," his voice was calm, controlled, like Will's had been. "I believe you were speaking to this lady." The ringleader, a rancher's son named Cole, sneered. "This ain't your business, Harrison." "It is now." Daniel held his ground. "You'll apologize to this lady, or you'll deal with me." Cole looked at his friends, looked at Daniel. Saw something in the boy's eyes that made him reconsider. Something hard. Something that said this fight wouldn't go the way he expected. "Sorry," Cole muttered, louder, and to her, not me. Cole's face reddened, but he turned to the girl. "Sorry for the mess. It wasn't much, but it was something." The 3 boys left their bravado deflated. Daniel turned to the girl. She was staring at him with wide ease. "You all right, miss?" She nodded. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "My grandfather taught me different." Daniel helped her gather the scattered groceries, his movements careful and respectful. "He taught me that when you see someone being torn down, you stand up, even if it costs you." "Your grandfather sounds wise." "He was," Daniel smiled, "and stubborn, and brave enough to change this whole town." The girl's name was Emma. She was new to Ellington, her family having emigrated from Italy 6 months ago. Her father worked in the mines. Her mother took in sewing. They were struggling but determined. Daniel walked her home, carrying her groceries, listening to her talk about the old country and new dreams. At her door, she thanked him again. "Will I see you around town?" she asked shyly. "Count on it," Daniel said. He rode back to the ranch as the sun set, feeling strange. Good strange. Like he'd done something important. Like he'd honored Will's memory in a way that mattered. Eleanor was waiting on the porch when he arrived. She took one look at his face and smiled. "You helped someone today." How did you know? Because you have your grandfather's eyes right now. The look he got when he'd stood up for something. Eleanor gestured to the chair next to her. Tell me about it. Daniel told her about the boys and Emma and how he'd stepped in without thinking. You did good, Eleanor said when he finished. Will would be proud. I keep thinking about what he said, about legacy, about how it's not the land or the money, it's the choice to do what's right. That's exactly what it is. Eleanor looked out over the ranch, the land she and Will had built together. This place will be yours someday. All of it. The cattle, the buildings, the debts, and the profits. But the real inheritance is in here. She tapped Daniel's chest over his heart. It's knowing when to stand up, when to defend, when to show mercy, and when to demand justice. That's what Will gave me, and that's what we're giving you. 5 years later, 1909. Daniel was 18 now, a young man rather than a boy. He'd turned the ranch profitable again, expanded the herds, earned the respect of the hands who worked for him. And he'd courted Emma patiently and properly until her father gave his blessing. They married in the spring in the small church where Will and Eleanor had wed. Eleanor stood as witness-proud, tears in her eyes. At the reception, Daniel found his grandmother alone for a moment. Do you miss him? He asked. Every day. Eleanor's hand went to the cameo at her throat, the one Will had given her so long ago. But he's not really gone. He's in you, in the choices you make, in the way you stand up for people. I'm trying to live up to what he taught me. You already are. Eleanor squeezed his hand. And one day you'll teach your children, and they'll teach theirs. That's how legacy works. It's passed down in stories and values and the courage to do what's right even when it's hard. Daniel thought about that often in the years to come, as he raised 4 children, as he watched them grow and scatter across the country, as he aged and the world changed around him, 2 wars and a depression and progress that would have amazed Will. But some things didn't change. The ranch stayed in Harrison hands. The journal stayed in the family. And the story of Will and Eleanor of standing up to evil, of fighting for justice, was told and retold until it became legend. 50 years after Will's death, Daniel Harrison sat in the same chair where his grandfather had told him the story. He was 63 now, silver-haired, scarred by time and work and life. And he was telling his own grandson the tale. Your great-great-grandfather, William Harrison, died in 1904, Daniel said. But his legacy didn't. He taught me that broken doesn't mean worthless. That courage is acting despite fear. That one person standing up can change everything. The boy, also named William, listened with wide ease. And now I'm passing it to you, Daniel continued. The ranch, the journal, the responsibility. The Harrisons don't just own land. We stand for something. We protect people who can't protect themselves. We fight for justice. We refuse to quit. He handed over the journal, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of hands. Read this, learn from it, and when your time comes, pass it on. Young William opened the book to the first page. Will Harrison's handwriting from 1865 stared back at him. Today the war ended. I'm going home. But I don't know what I'm going home to. Everything I loved is gone. I feel empty. He flipped forward, found another entry. Today I met a woman they call cursed. But I see something else. I see possibility. She might be the one to save me, or I might save her. Either way, I'm not running anymore. I'm done hiding. Tomorrow I fight. The story went on. Page after page of Will's life, Eleanor's courage, the battle against Thornton, the love that grew in the spaces between survival and victory. And at the very end, dated a week before Will's death, one final entry. To whoever reads this, whenever you read it, remember, the Harrison legacy isn't land or money. It's the choice to stand up when everyone else sits down, to defend the defenseless, to fight for justice even when it costs everything. I've lived that choice. I've paid its price, and I do it again, because some things are worth dying for, and even more things are worth living for. Be brave, be kind, be strong, and never ever give up. That's what it means to be a Harrison. Young William closed the journal, his heart pounding. He looked at his grandfather, at the legacy stretching back through time, at the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. I'll make you proud, he said. All of you, I promise. Daniel smiled, the same smile Will had given him so long ago. You already have, just by being willing to carry it forward. Outside, the Wyoming sun set over Harrison Ranch. The land Will had built, the legacy he'd forged, the story that would echo through generations. Broken soldiers and crippled widows, courage found in darkness, love discovered in survival, justice won at terrible cost, and a simple truth passed down from father to son, grandmother to grandson across the turning years. Stand up, fight back, protect the weak. That was the Harrison